Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today I just wanted to talk about the books that I've been reading this week. And it's been quite a fun one. Some kind of chunkier books, some significantly less chunky books. Yeah, so let's get talking a little bit more about these lovely little ones as well. And I'm going to start this, perhaps almost unusually, with a book that I haven't actually finished reading yet, but I'm sort of on my way to. And please ignore the kind of various price stickers and everything all over it. But that's Possession by AS Byatt. And, you know, sort of full disclosure, this is going to go live on a Sunday. I'm filming it on a Friday. I normally film around these times for the Sunday ones. And literally about 20 minutes before I was about to film this, a BBC News thing came through that AS Byatt, the author of this book, has sadly just passed away at the age of 87. And so it sort of feels like it was one of those things where I was debating kind of saving this for next week because I haven't quite finished it yet, but thought actually, you know, I'm quite near the end, and just as a sort of thing to kind of be like, actually, yeah, you know, this is maybe her best known book, Possession. It's the book that won her the Booker Prize in 1990. And she was an author of many, many other books, none of which really I've read. I've read this, and well, after this I'll have just read this and children's book by her, her two Booker shortlisted books. And you know, I think Possession itself, although I've been struggling with parts of it, a big part of why I've been struggling with it is because she's kind of put everything into this book in really quite the most astounding way. It's you know, the official name is technically Possession: a romance, and at the heart of it are a set of characters really trying to find love and sort of understand something that's happened between them. But this book does it in this really interesting way where you'll have whole pages that are a long poem, or you'll have letters written between characters, or you'll have another character who is sort of going through literary criticism and trying to understand something, and you'll have another character who writes things almost as these sort of short stories. And all of this therefore kind of comes together as this very literary novel in many senses, right? It's not just a literary novel in the sort of subject area or the kind of topics or how it's written or anything like that. It's also a very literary novel in the sense that it is a novel and poetry and bits of essays and letters and literary criticism, and it's all of this kind of bound up in one, which I think really makes it quite extraordinary. So even though I'm a little bit lost in the plot, I have to admit, I'm not fully sure what's happening a lot of the time, and I think I've forgotten who some of the characters are. But what's really impressive is how she's managed to make almost like a writer's book almost. It's kind of like she's almost like a writer's writer and a reader's writer at the same time in this book, and it's really quite astounding how she's been able to do that. So I'm not surprised it won the Booker in that sense. Yeah, as much as I'm sort of struggling with it, it's just one of those things where it's sad to lose someone like AS Byatt, who apart from winning the Booker Prize has just been this, you know, this author of beloved books in many ways, and I hope her family are doing well in the midst of all of this as well. Continuing a little bit on the Booker front, you may notice I'm sort of going back and reading the winners, kind of in time for the Booker winners announcement fairly soon. And the next one I read, was sort of a reread, is Ruth Prawer Jhabvala's Heat and Dust. And I read this, I think I must have been 17 or 18. And I'd kind of forgotten some of the details, but it's really beautiful revisiting this book. Ostensibly it's about one woman, a sort of British woman living in India and her sort of life, and then her daughter coming back years later to try and understand her life. And what's sort of so fascinating is just the ways that those reflections are both the sort of talking about the family and, you know, how you remember your parents, how you sort of look back at them, how you try to decode things that happen in their lives, but also all of this set against another country and set against empire and set against all these other things. And so you've got these really complicated things at play with each other, because she's not just trying to understand her mother, she's also trying to understand her mother in India, she's also trying to understand India, she's trying to understand herself. It's all these sorts of really complicated webs of things, but just this really beautiful writing. It's a very astute novel, I think, in terms of, for again, relatively short amount of pages. I'm a fan of a short novel, and I think this does it very well, of just really stripping it down to the bare bones of these beautiful, poignant descriptions of place and of memory and of various other things. So I really, really enjoyed rereading this, and I'd forgotten a lot of it as it happened. Weirdly, my resounding memory from it was literally just someone talking about a slightly shall we say, over amorous man. And weirdly, that I say weirdly, that's the thing that stuck in my mind as a 17-year-old. And then here we are 17 years later, me reading it and being like, oh yeah, this was that same book. Okay, cool. But no, a really, really beautifully quiet and thoughtful book, I think. Staying quickly on the Booker thing again, I'm reading old long lists, sorry, older short lists and the winners. So sort of my reading weeks are sort of a little bit dominated by Booker at the moment. Not like they're not always, but like a little bit more so maybe. And so I read Oryx and Crake by Margaret Atwood. And Atwood is an author who I can very happily read almost anything by. I love her style of writing. I think she's really astute. I think she's really clever, but also in this very fun and warm and wise kind of way. And Oryx and Crake is part of a trilogy. And this first book is the first book in that trilogy, in which she sort of imagines this alternate world where there are these kind of creatures that are sort of hybrids with each other. So you've got these kind of odd concoctions of very bizarre creatures, and this sort of animal world. And this is sort of, I suppose, maybe from her body of work, this is probably Margaret Atwood at her most kind of sci-fi fantasy kind of side of things, but I think still with a very Atwood focus to it. It's this very it's still a lot about sort of social order and social like power dynamics. That's sort of something that appears a lot in Atwood's work, and I really enjoy a lot of her sort of discussions on some of those things. And that comes out here, where there's a lot about sort of sexual hierarchy, or about the kind of ethics that go into some of this creation of animals. And so, yeah, I found this really fun in many ways, but also a little bit struggled. I love Atwood. I occasionally was a little bit lost at what was happening in some of these stories, but also I was here for the ride. Atwood is an incredibly fun author, I think, and this felt like something else in that, even if, again, I didn't always fully gel with what was happening. Next, on to something very different itself, Nathan Hill with Wellness. And so this is a book that I think in the UK comes out in January. I think in the US it's already out. And this is a book that I think actually really deserves its length. It's about 600 pages, and it's a book that tells this sort of family epic. In many ways, very, very much reminded me of The Bee Sting in all my favourite ways. Less of a sort of twisty ending part, but still very good. Essentially, the core idea of this book, or some of the core ideas, I guess, are how the book examines our obsession with wellness culture as a society, particularly sort of Western, sort of more capitalist societies, really obsessed with this idea of wellness and almost this idea of perfecting the human. So the idea that we are going to track every single part of our lives, you know, how much sleep we got, how many steps we're doing as a sort of basic thing, but then taking it into further things around macronutrients and around like the real specifics of like what you're doing during the day and your energy levels and spikes and all that kind of thing. And it kind of examines how often those sorts of bits of seeking perfection are kind of can leave us feeling quite hollow inside. And what I think the book does really quite successfully is occasionally pivots between various things that seem completely disparate and unconnected, but actually come together quite satisfyingly at the end, I think. So, for example, a really big part of this book is around online culture. And so the idea of particularly sort of social media clout or kind of virality. And so he talks a lot in this book. This is a novel, but his characters have a lot of discussion around some of these things. So, for example, our main character's father one of the main characters, his father, is getting sort of drawn further and further into extreme conspiracy theory things online because of algorithms and how those algorithms are feeding his newsfeed. And that sets up a kind of conflict with his son. That same son is a photographer whose workplace, this university, is trying to make him sort of become more viral. They're kind of trying to find ways in which his work can be shared by people. And there's a monetary value attached to it where, you know, it's $4 for a share from the average Joe, but $2,000 if it's shared by a Kardashian, for example. And these sorts of things where the metrics of sort of what constitutes success are complicated. And those things start to map together. So as the story goes on, we start to see how bits of those are pulled together. So some of the tracking of data of your day-to-day life, some of the tracking of data around sort of virality, a few things in terms of relationships, particularly the kind of core relationship at the heart of this book between our two main characters. And I just thought this was a really fun, almost satire of so much of sort of modern day culture in a way that for me didn't feel too tacked on. Sometimes those criticisms can feel a lot more you know, basic and sort of like, internet bad. And I think this book does a little bit better at deconstructing that. It sort of almost takes aim at kind of meta and also at like goop and that sort of side of wellness industries and a few other things all at once. And I found it really satisfying, but also just an incredibly funny book, an incredibly tender book. I was really blown away by this. I listened to it as an audiobook and, you know, it's what, like 18 hours of audio. I was really, not to say hanging on every word, that's maybe a bit extreme. I was really heavily invested in this book and was really profoundly moved by it, was really touched by it, but also found it hilarious and thought-provoking in many ways as well. So yeah, I really highly recommend this. And for UK folks, I have no idea outside of the UK and US publishing sort of timelines on this, but for the UK, for people in the UK, it will come out in January. And I feel like actually probably could be a good contender for the Booker in 2024. But there we go. Early predictions made. But yeah, a really great book, I think, in many ways. And then to continue my puns, November. So I read these two books that I mentioned I was going to read as part of November, where I sort of try and read any Ernaux books that I've not read so far. And at least of the ones published in English, I think I've now read them all. But The Young Man, let's start with here. The Young Man, which I keep on... People from the UK may sort of recognise this sort of like young man thing that goes through my head every time I hear this. Don't worry if you don't know it. It's probably for the best. So the whole Young Man book is about Annie Ernaux having an affair with a younger man. It's a very short book, even for Ernaux standard. This is about 30 pages. She sort of details this affair that's this really interesting thing. She's very aware of power dynamics throughout. She is aware of not becoming his sort of mother figure, but also recognizes that that may be part of the appeal for him. And she's also aware that, you know, he's a bit more vulnerable. They're both in relationships when this starts, or at least Annie Ernaux is just coming out of one. And she's aware that this man may leave his girlfriend for her, and then she sort of sees this as a casual fling, so it may be a bit more complicated. So yeah, just a fun sort of, in the kind of the canon of Annie Ernaux talking about sex and love and relationships, this is kind of a fun addition. And then on her wider, more socio-political writings, I Will Write to Avenge My People is the speech that she gave at the Nobel Prize ceremony when she won. Well, it's kind of two speeches and a bit of a bio in this book. Again, a very, very short book, about 30 pages. And her speech basically takes the form of her talking about the power of writing and how she wrote these words, "I will write to avenge my people," in a diary or notebook of hers when she was quite young, as her sort of almost mantra or kind of focus for her writing. And she talks about how she was trying to give a voice to women, and particularly to how women are represented in writing, and how the kinds of topics that women are almost allowed or not allowed to write about, which I found really, really interesting. And so, yeah, always more Ernaux is always a fun thing for me. I do love her writing. And last but not least, and I did a video separately on this where I was sort of riffing on this and sort of thinking a bit more about memory. And that's Wish I Was Here by M. John Harrison. He's a sort of experimental novelist and sort of sci-fi novelist a lot of the time. And Wish I Was Here is his memoir, or anti-memoir, as he puts here, where he essentially challenges the idea of what a memoir is meant to do. He talks a lot about how memoirs are meant to be, well, often presented as if they're going to be this retelling of all of the secrets and mysteries that you never knew about this famous person's life. And this famous person would have all these very exciting adventures and all these things and these secrets, and it's, all of this. And he talks about how most people's lives are a lot more mundane. And even if they do have these sort of exciting lives, the way we remember our lives is heavily biased by not only which memories we keep and don't keep, but also how people have reacted to them over our time. So we may think that we have a strong sense of our lives and who we are, but actually we have created a fiction itself. And so I just found this really interesting, not only because the writing in this is stunning, but also because I think it's a really challenging book about these ideas of why do we write memoirs, who are they for, what purpose do they serve, how much can we trust them? And actually I really enjoyed him poking the bear on that we often don't necessarily sit and challenge this idea of memory. We think of our lives as this sort of narrative that's linear, where action A happens when we're a child, and then 5 years later we meet that person again and we think about this other thing, and then a few years later it comes up again, and wow, what a happy coincidence. But all of these things have lived within a narrative. And actually he has these things that he calls nout books, a sort of play on words from notebook, where he writes sort of these things down and sort of reveals almost the everyday and the mundane, or the thoughts he had. And he realizes that all of these are kind of just little constructions that don't really make sense in a wider narrative. And I really enjoyed that he sort of ends this book kind of without a triumphant finish. It's not a kind of, and now look at me, I'm doing all this. It kind of ends on that note. And I really, really appreciated what this book did here. I thought it was brilliant. I thought it was clever. I think it's easily going to be in my top non-fiction books of the year. I just think it's a really clever book, a book that was one of those, when you read those books and you're like, this book is far cleverer than I am. You're reading it being like, I'm sure, great. Do I know what this means? Who knows? But I just think it's brilliant in many, many ways. And I really, really enjoyed reading this. And so those are the books that I read this week, with wellness somewhere here as well, if you imagine it. Yeah, I'll finish the AS Byatt book, Possession, but kind of just had another note to kind of say, yeah, I'm intrigued to go and read a lot of her writing. It's often the sort of sad thing where when somebody, not necessarily just a writer, but when anyone really passes away, that's often the time when we then sit and sort of say like, oh, I'm going to finally read their work, and then suddenly realize what we've maybe been missing out on all that time. So yeah, but either way, this is what I've been reading this week. I hope you are doing really well. I hope you're having a good week, and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.